Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I had initially planned another video for this weekend, which was going to be the second part of the ACF video, but I've just received some news yesterday that I thought I would share with you guys. You saw the title, that's right, I am no longer a doctor, no more Dr. Kitty Wong, just Miss Kitty Wong, and the reason for that is just because I've just passed the MRCS Part B exam. So in addition to applying for my ACF and my CST jobs this year, the other big thing that's been occupying my time over the last few months has been studying for the MRCS Part B exam. And for those of you that don't know, the MRCS, or the membership for the Royal College of Surgeons exam, is required in order for me to enter higher surgical training. The exam is split into Part A, which is a written paper that I sat and passed last year in F1, and Part B, which is an OSCE and Viva exam. When you've passed both of these components, you then become a member of a Royal Surgical College and earn the right to use the title Mr. or Miss or Mrs. or whatever you like associated with surgeons rather than a doctor. So I've effectively just spent 5 years in medical school and a couple extra grand to lose my doctor title, so you know, that's great. The results actually came out a day earlier than I expected, and I was just checking the Royal College of Surgeons website on a whim and I literally nearly fell off my chair. And honestly, I'm incredibly relieved after a week of being a ball of apprehension and anxiety, which I'm sure really annoyed my colleagues. And I was genuinely worried about failing this exam because it's so difficult to know how you scored. But I actually did quite well with 293 marks out of 340, which is around 86%. Jokes aside, I just wanted to make a video about what I thought about the exam content, what I thought about my preparation in retrospect, and what the experience was like. And much like for the MRCS Part A exam, I will release a more detailed video later about exactly how I prepared for my exam and the resources that I've used. Overall, I thought the exam was quite difficult and it was very intense, which is what I had expected. The Part B exam was separated into a knowledge component, which included anatomy, pathology and critical care, and a clinical skills component for history taking, communication, examination and practical surgical skills. In terms of the knowledge part of the exam, I found that the anatomy stations were actually pretty straightforward, and if anything, I had felt like I was actually overdoing my studying for this part of the exam. Not that that's a bad thing at all, and not that I'm complaining. In this particular sitting of the exam, we were just given cadaveric images rather than actual specimens, and they were all really good quality, so there was sort of no confusion about separate structures or what the examiner was pointing at. The critical care and physiology stations were difficult, I felt, but probably fair. I probably could have spent a little bit more time studying for this in retrospect, particularly relating sort of clinical findings to scientific explanations and physiology. The pathology stations were probably the hardest part of the exam in that there were quite a few rogue questions. So for example, about microbiology or identifying organisms based on what they looked like under the microscope. And to be honest, even if I had another month or two to study it, I don't think I probably would know the answer to these questions. But reassuringly, they were really in the minority, and speaking to my other colleagues who sat the same sitting of the exam, they were equally bewildered by the same questions, so it wasn't just me. For the clinical skills component, I thought this was generally much easier than the knowledge component. For history taking, as long as you sort of had a good structure, this is almost applicable to most stations and scenarios. And similarly for the examination stations, as long as you had practiced this prior and could formulate key differentials and some initial next steps for investigations and management, you could go through most of the marks in the station, and none of them were sort of very niche things that you don't encounter in real life clinical practice. The communication station relied on a lot of soft skills, which again I felt was relatively simple, and as long as you kept some key principles in mind, such as capacity, safeguarding, consenting patients, and usually the actor will be able to lead you in the direction of where the marks are, so that wasn't too difficult. The particular skill stations I got was pretty straightforward actually, and the only thing some colleagues found difficult in terms of performing the skill was that often you would get asked questions as you're doing the skill, which can be quite distracting. In terms of preparing for the exam, I had about 3 solid months or so to revise, and I chose to do so during my academic block and GP rotation, which were 2 very relaxed jobs with no out-of-hours work, which really helped my revision. In retrospect, I think the results from these 3 months of intense revision clearly sort of worked out well from the result I got, although at the time of taking the exam, I thought I probably would have liked another month or so, just because it took me a few weeks in the beginning to get a grasp of what I needed to know and what was the best way to study. I'll talk about the details of different resources I'd used in a separate video, but I think that one thing that struck me was how different the preparation for the Part B exam was compared to the Part A of the MRCS. I almost felt like I was preparing for a completely different exam, to be honest, aside from maybe sort of anatomy knowledge. And as opposed to just smashing out question banks, studying for Part B took a lot more planning and reading around the topic, and overall there was a lot more sort of uncertainty on what you needed to know, and I struggled to identify one resource that ruled them all. Do you know what I mean? Like, nothing that truly felt like it encompassed everything that I needed to know. And I think the MRCS exam is definitely more about the breadth of your knowledge rather than the depth, and as a result there were many occasions where I was really worried because I don't know what I don't know. I was also particularly concerned about the clinical side of things because as an F2 I felt like I had less practical surgical experience compared to most of the other candidates sitting the exam who were usually core trainees. But I mean, clearly it worked out okay, and I really think it's about sort of fine-tuning your history taking an examination in a limited time. From this front, it was really useful to have someone to practice with, or in my case, someone to practice on, which is my poor fiance. But it worked well, and I was able to sort of perfect examinations that I don't do on a day-to-day basis, such as, a knee examination. In terms of my experience of the exam on the day, I have to say that everyone was very well run by the college. In my case, this was the Royal College of Surgeons England in the London sitting. During my practice and revision, I haven't really struggled with time when I timed myself, so I didn't find this to be a huge issue either on the day, and I finished most of my stations with time to spare. If I didn't answer all the questions in the station, it was more because I didn't know the answer and saved the difficult questions for last, as opposed to running out of time. I think that the timing for the examination stations and history stations were a little bit more tight because you had to do all that and then leave enough time to present your findings and answer the relevant questions the examiner asks you at the end. I think that, as we know with most OSCEs from medical school, part of the exam technique is to be able to sort of move on mentally from one station once it's finished and try not to dwell too much on it, so even if you didn't do very well. And I found that I did have to sort of remind myself actively about this a couple of times during the circuit on the day, but generally the exam was intense enough that in reality you didn't really have time or the mental capacity to sort of dwell on anything anyways. Overall, I thought that most of the examiners were quite friendly, they weren't really intimidating, and most of them allowed me to sort of skip any questions I wasn't sure about and sort of go back to them afterwards if there was time. Some of them were more proactive about this compared to others, but most of them were very receptive if I said, oh, can we go back to that question that I wasn't sure about earlier. So those are my immediate thoughts after passing the exam. As promised, I will make another video at a later date talking about how I prepared for the Part B exam in detail and the resources that I've used, but for now I'm going to have a break and enjoy the fact that I won't have to sit another exam until the FRCS and try not to think about the Royal College of Surgeons fees that I will have to pay for the next couple of years. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe, and leave a comment about any questions you want me to address in any future videos. That's it for now, and I will see you next time.